Hello and welcome to our Week 2 Supplemental lecture on Michel Foucault's What is Enlightenment? This piece is a response to Kant's What is Enlightenment piece. We have a podcast on that piece, and if you haven't listened to it yet, you should listen to that before you listen to this, because the two of them talk to each other. So Foucault is a major recent social and political theorist, and he's looking back and revisiting Kant's What is Enlightenment piece to ask what enlightenment might be understood to be for us today. Foucault's really amused by the fact that Kant writes this piece. He starts off and he talks about the fact that a newspaper today, when it wants to ask for public opinion, does a poll or something like that, it's asking for the everyday consensus of what we think. He thinks it's unusual to think of the idea of a great philosopher, a major intellectual powerhouse like Kant, being asked to contribute the answer to a question whose answer is not currently known. Foucault thinks that's amusing, but he picks up on it and wants to talk about what Kant is doing in this text and how it might touch on some broader themes in social and political philosophy. So he says it's a minor text for Kant, but it marks the discrete entrance into the history of thought of a question that modern philosophy has not been capable of answering, but that it has never managed to get rid of either. Okay, so Foucault's saying he's not going to be satisfied with what Kant says enlightenment is. He doesn't think anybody else has proposed a more adequate answer since then, but he thinks the question keeps bothering us, and it keeps bothering us for a reason, and it's an important question to grapple with, and he's going to grapple with it himself here today. Foucault says modern philosophy can be defined as the philosophy that is attempting to answer the question raised so imprudently 2 centuries ago. Okay, it's imprudent because Foucault thinks it's a huge question, very hard to answer, that Kant sort of dashes out of his 4-page response to. So what's the status of enlightenment, and what's different about the way that Kant is proposing that we think about it? Foucault says that it's not original in attempting to think about its own present time. Philosophy has done that forever. But philosophical reflection on the present has tended to take 3 specific forms, and they all involve thinking of very bounded periods of time, but in slightly different ways. So philosophy's thought about the present as belonging to a specific distinct era, where there's an understanding that history has several distinct eras, and we're in one of them that can be distinguished from the others by particular inherent characteristics. Or the present is understood as a bearer of signs for some future event that hasn't happened yet, but we can see that it's coming if we examine the present and treat it as a kind of cipher. Or the present is a moment of transition to a new world. So all of these Foucault thinks philosophy has tried a number of different times, but he thinks that Kant's approach is different, and it's not really thinking of the present in terms of these bounded periods of time with their particular characteristics. He's doing something new, and Foucault thinks that the new thing that he does remains of importance to us today. Foucault says Kant views the Enlightenment in an almost entirely negative way. This use of the word negative is going to come up again and again and again. People will be critical of things that only do things negatively, or they will like the fact that things only do things negatively. But it can be a little unclear what it means. It points back to some degree to a use of the term in a philosopher we won't read in this course, as Hegel. But the idea that in Kant, the Enlightenment is viewed as an exit, as an outgoing, as something that we're doing to get away from something else, and it is unclear what its own positive content is. So it is a negation. It is reacting back on and transcending something that came before, but it's unclear what we're headed into. Foucault says he is not seeking to understand the present on the basis of a totality or of a future achievement. He's looking for a difference. What difference does today introduce with respect to yesterday? Okay, so again, we'll hear the phrase totality in a number of theorists, and it shifts over time from something that people can think of quite positively to something that they tend in more recent theory to think of negatively, or a future achievement. A lot of more recent theory is very suspicious of the idea that we think we know where history is headed, that there is a particular endpoint, whether it's liberal capitalism or communism or some other kind of utopia, that we think we're going to achieve. There's a lot of contemporary theoretical suspicion worrying that visions like that help to rationalize oppressive forms of political practice and governmental systems. So Foucault is saying Kant is not guilty of that. Whatever thinkers we may criticize for what they think, this isn't what Kant is doing, at least in this aspect of this piece. But Enlightenment has an ambiguous status in Kant's text. And Foucault picks on something that is particularly interesting to Foucault, that he wrestles with through a lot of his works, and that we'll revisit next week when we take a look at some other works by Foucault. Foucault says that in Kant, the Enlightenment is both a process and an obligation. It's a very strange ontological phenomenon. It's a very strange thing at the level of being. It is a process, but it's a process that occurs only to the extent that people participate as voluntary actors. So it's not a process that's just going to happen to us externally. It's a process that we do. It's something that we do. And because it's something that we can do, it's something that we have an obligation to do. There is a moral charge involved in making sure we participate in the Enlightenment. And Foucault says this is very strange. It makes us at once elements and agents of a single process. Is the Enlightenment something that happens to and through us? Is it something that we are doing and enacting? Its status is ambiguous. And Foucault says it's also a little bit unclear who participates in this process. Is this meant to be a process that affects and therefore includes all of humanity? Or is something a little bit more sinister going on? Is Kant suggesting that only those who are capable or willing to participate in this process get to count as being fully human? And obviously there are different political implications depending on which of those we think the text means. Okay, so there are dark sides and promising sides to this concept of enlightenment. And Foucault picks up on Kant's public-private distinction. And he raises an interesting point about it. He says it inverts the distinction that you would think would be really active in Kant's time, which is the distinction between your private ability to freely exercise your conscience, to practice your religion, that privatized religious space which was gradually rolled out in European countries as an attempt to end the wars of religion that had been ripping those countries apart. Foucault said, weirdly, Kant's distinction between public and private kind of inverts that. So reason must be free publicly, but obedient privately. So it's not that you have freedom in your private or domestic life. That's not what Kant is talking about. You actually specifically have freedom in your public life. But where you're acting as an individual or as a cog in some sort of social institution, there you need to obey. And so Foucault says there is enlightenment when the universal, the free, and the public uses of reason are superimposed on one another. You have to meet all three of those conditions to be part of the Enlightenment. And then he talks about the way in which Kant relates this to political authority. So on the one hand, you've got Kant trying to reassure political authorities that if they allow the free public use of reason, that's the best way to ensure that people will be politically obedient. But there's a threat involved in that promise, because Kant also says that this is only true to the degree that the monarch, that the sovereign, enacts rules that conform to reason. So free public use of reason will reinforce the performance of rational rules. Okay, and then Foucault addresses, as almost every text we're going to look at this week addresses, the issue of modernity and what it is, and how it relates to these notions of enlightenment and progress and the rest. Like many of the other texts that you could read this week, Foucault says the term sounds like it's historical, it sounds like it's a time period, and then we can think there might be a pre-modernity and a post-modernity sort of marked out in time. But he says this isn't the best way to understand this term. It's best understood as an attitude. And he thinks it's an attitude that Kant's text begins to express and outlines. And that attitude includes a way of relating to contemporary reality, a voluntary choice made by certain people, maybe by all people, maybe not, a way of thinking and feeling and acting and belonging, but it presents itself as a task. It has a moral charge to it, as though you have an obligation to do this. And then he moves to Baudelaire, who's a 19th century poet, and Baudelaire is also, we're not reading him this term, but he's a reference figure that you'll see pop up in a number of texts. He's a reference point for a lot of people as someone who particularly articulates the attitude of modernity, and so Foucault is following in that way of approaching Baudelaire. And pulling on Baudelaire, Foucault says that the attitude of modernity is aware of a break with tradition. But it's a specific kind of break from tradition. It is not like fashion, Foucault says, which just seeks out the new for newness' sake. It's aiming for something that is eternal within the present moment. Okay, it's reaching for a universal in the midst of this flux and change and ephemerality. So the present is recognized as fleeting, but it is also something that is rendered heroic by the attitude of modernity. Okay, so it's different from just sensitivity to change. Foucault also says it's ironic. Okay, it involves an ironic orientation. He says the high value of the present is indissociable from a desperate eagerness to imagine it otherwise than what it is, and to transform it not by destroying it, but by grasping it. Okay, so there's an extremely high value placed on the present, but that high value is not associated with making it sacred and protecting it and trying to preserve it and keeping it from changing. We are trying to transform the very thing that we are appreciating, and we're trying to transform it by understanding it, not even necessarily by changing it, but by grasping it in a particular way, by viewing it in a particular light. And Foucault says that that is an ironic sensibility, that we both build something up to such a degree precisely because we want to criticize it, or in and through criticizing it. And then again he hits on a point that is of particular importance for his work, and we'll take a look at this again next week when we look at some more Foucault pieces. He says it involves an ascetic relationship to self. Now this may sound very strange if you've not previously read in social and political theory, but it's actually a theme that a number of people hit on. It's by no means the consensus about what modernity is. Superficially you look at modernity and it looks like we have enormous accumulations of material wealth. People are enormously better off and more comfortable in at least parts of the world than we ever have been. In what sense is this ascetic? And yet the idea that there's something ascetic about us is something that is important for Foucault, it's important for Weber, it's important for Marx. A number of foundational figures pick up on it. And we'll look at this again in a couple of weeks when we look again at Foucault and when we introduce some figures like Weber and Marx. So Foucault's going to say modernity does not liberate people. It's not that you're suddenly free to produce yourself. It's that you have an obligation to produce yourself, and that's a form of coercion. It's a form of self-coercion, but it's baked into the idea of modernity. And again, this is something that a number of really quite contemporary authors, Zizek comes to mind, will pick up on as well. And then Foucault notes that for Baudelaire, these qualities cannot be produced within everyday social or political life, but are the specific products of art. Okay, and this gets back to something that we talked about in the Kant lecture in relation to how some of these ideas make their way into contemporary notions of academic freedom. The idea that you can have certain kinds of critical sensibilities as long as you cordon them off from practical application. So academic freedom is one manifestation of this. The notion that you exercise these critical sensibilities in art, which is something that you contemplate apart from everyday practice, that it's in its own sphere, is another one of these ways that this is articulated as we go forward in history. And then he wants to look at our current relationship to the concept of enlightenment, and he has two sections here, negative and positive. So negative, things that we don't want to accept, and positive, things that we can turn that concept into if we're going to perpetuate it now. And here he makes a very, very interesting comment, and it's very important for many of the debates that we're going to look at later in the term. He talks about the blackmail of enlightenment, and he says you do not want to succumb to the blackmail of enlightenment. So what's that blackmail? The blackmail is the insistence that you have to choose one of two possible choices, and that those are your only options, one or the other. Declare yourself now. And those options are that you either accept the Enlightenment and remain within the tradition of its rationalism, or else you criticize the Enlightenment and then try to escape from its principles of rationality. Okay, so the choice that's presented is either you accept absolutely everything and remain within the bounds of reason, or if you're going to criticize Enlightenment, you throw the whole thing out and you become a frank irrationalist. And we will see at various points through the course this dichotomy, these two choices being presented and sometimes embraced. So some people will say, yeah, okay, I'm going to be critical of the Enlightenment, and that does make me an irrationalist. More often you'll see people saying, no, this is a false dichotomy, like Foucault is saying. The Komarov reading this week is making a somewhat similar point. It is possible to criticize these things while finding them valuable and staying within the bounds of a discourse of reasons. But frequently people trying to walk that line find themselves of being criticized, of being irrationalists by other people. So when we get to the Science Week and we start looking at critics of science and technology, or people who are trying to do critical studies of these, their opponents will often say they're just throwing everything out. They're renouncing the universal values of the Enlightenment. They are outside the space of reasons. We have to fight them. Okay, and some of the people we'll read that week will actually agree that they're outside the space of reasons, but most of them are trying to walk a kind of line like Foucault is trying to walk here. He says you don't have to make this choice. So what do we do with the concept of enlightenment if we're not going to make that choice? Well, he thinks that we can have the notion of critique that is in the service of the transgression of boundaries. One of the problems Foucault has with Kant is he thinks that Kant is super sensitive to boundaries and is being overly reassuring to political and social authorities that we can keep our critique within the right bounds and it's not going to threaten anyone. Foucault doesn't want to accept those boundaries. He wants the critique to be able to apply itself more fluidly. The critique is no longer for Foucault going to be in the service of universals. And again, this is something that is hotly debated, and we will see people who become very angry at the notion that we're not after universals, as well as people who think we shouldn't be after universals. We'll look at those with reference to science, politics, and economics. They come up everywhere. Critique is not transcendental. It does not sit outside of the society of which it is a part. Okay, so Kant's appeal to something like a human nature as a thing that sits outside society and that puts a check on things, Foucault's going to try not to appeal to that. And in fact, Foucault's work spends a lot of time trying to think about the changing differences in human nature over time, including different forms of embodiment. It's historical and genealogical. It pays attention to the past and to the present as a moment in a historical process that may be very discontinuous. And it's experimental and open-ended. Okay, so we don't know what the boundaries of our critique are. Okay, and he makes a nice statement here. It will not deduce from the form of what we are what it is impossible for us to do and to know. Okay, what does he mean by this? What does he have in mind? If you think about some of the social movements that have shaped the societies we live in today, many of those movements were throwing themselves against boundaries, where the boundaries were created because people were sure they knew what were the limits of what we could do. Okay, so they were sure that women could not govern their own affairs, that racial minorities could not be made equal. Boundaries that are going on today where people are fighting over marriage and its extension beyond heterosexual couples. This kind of boundary. Frequently people will invoke the idea that we've never done this before, and what we've done up to now historically defines what we can be. Foucault is saying it does not. We don't know what we can be based on what we have been. So the critical sensibility that he wants to invoke is open to the possibility that we in fact could become quite radically different from what we have been. You cannot look at history for Foucault and say, because we've never done it, we never can. But what it will do in looking at history is it will separate out from the contingency that has made us what we are. So there's nothing necessary for Foucault about history. From the contingency that has made us what we are, the possibility of no longer being, doing, or thinking what we are, do, or think. So what can history teach us? It does not teach us what we cannot do, but it shows us some of the wide variety of things that we have done. And if we think about that, we may realize that some of the things we currently take for granted as being essential and intrinsic aspects of the human are actually things that other societies didn't possess. And that gives us a feel for what is contingent in our present moment. So the engagement with history is about opening up our sense of the possible rather than about shutting down our sense of the possible. It is not seeking to make possible a metaphysics that has finally become a science, This is some of what some of the Enlightenment figures thought they were doing, is turning metaphysics into a science. It is seeking to give a new impetus as far and wide as possible to the undefined work of freedom. Open-ended, critical, ongoing, and Foucault thinks that this is what we can take away from a contemporary engagement with the Enlightenment.